Crystal friends, welcome back to Opus Elenae, where we actually, first of all, before I get into anything else, let me just yes. So Opus Elenae officially has 10,000 subscribers here on YouTube. Part of me feels like it's taken forever, and part of me feels like it's been overnight. I don't have the words to convey how overwhelmed and grateful and proud and excited I am. I couldn't have done this without all of you, and I just appreciate all of you so much. Where was I? Right. Welcome back to Opus Elenae, where we make beautiful and practical things no matter our skill level. One of the best and easiest ways to step up the historical adequacy of your kit is proper headwear. And one of the most versatile pieces of headwear for us femme types is the St Birgitta cap or huva. It's a cap that's sort of an oversized coif gathered at the bottom edge to form a pouch at the nape of the neck. The cap is secured with a tie that goes from nape of the neck, crosses at the top of the head, and loops at the back of the head. It doesn't look like it should stay, but the friction of the linen keeps it remarkably secure. You can see them in manuscripts and paintings dating from the late 13th century all the way to the 15th. The extant cap, which did belong to St Birgitta of Sweden, patron saint of Sweden and widows, whose feast day is coming up on October 8th, has a lovely 3-row interlaced herringbone insertion stitch in the seam down the middle that is both beautiful and intimidating, especially for beginners. So today we're going to tell perfectionism to get stuffed and make 3 different St. Birgitta caps, each increasing in complexity, and you can choose whether you're in the mood for a beginner, intermediate, or advanced project. So everyone go grab your cuppa. Today I'm drinking Necromancer from the Weeping Glass. I know I drink this every fall, but with the maple and vanilla notes and the bright red orange safflower petals, it's like my go-to autumnal tea. Let's get into it. Time to dig into my Closet O fabric. This project will consist of 3 different caps, so I'm going to be using 3 different colors of handkerchief weight linen: bright white, black, and cream. In manuscripts, these are almost always seen in white, but I thought it might be fun to make different colors. After finding my fabric and cleaning up, the studio isn't that big. I'm going to take a few minutes to starch and iron my linen before diving into the cutting and sewing. This is especially important when working with handkerchief weight linen, since it tends to be more wiggly than heavier weights. Next up, time to trace the coif. I'm not drafting my own pattern here, but instead I'm using the one from the Catafalque blog, link in the description.
I prefer this particular pattern over others because the front and bottom edges form a more obtuse angle rather than the 90-degree one I see on some other drafts, as well as that corner being rounded instead of sharp. This allows for a larger pocket for long hair at the base of the skull, as well as easier gather distribution along that lower edge. If you have shorter hair, you can decrease that angle a little bit, bringing it closer to 90 degrees. You just have to make sure that the length of the top curve will accommodate the measurement of your head from hairline to nape of neck, including your bun. Each one of these caps is going to start off with the same pieces, 2 sides of the cap and a long strip of 2.5-inch wide linen or 2 shorter strips that will be sewn together. I'm tracing each half of the coif separately since this pattern doesn't include seam allowance. The bright white cap will be the simplest. I'll start off by sewing the 2 halves of the coif together from the front edge over the curve and down to the marked point, leaving the last part open in a slit to the bottom hem. I'm taking care to reinforce the seam at that bottom end since it will be a point of stress. Once that seam is sewn, I will fell each half of the seam allowance separately to its own side. This will allow the felled allowances to transition into a double folded hem for the slit at the bottom of that seam. Normally there would be a gap in between the 2 halves that would be filled with insertion stitching, but I have found that the cap is forgiving enough not to be too small without the extra space in between. The next step is running the gathering stitches from the marked point around that tight curve and all along the bottom of the cap. I'm doing 2 parallel lines of running stitches, and I'm trying to make each set of stitches roughly the same length so the gathers will be nice and neat. quick double check of the measurement from the center front of my hairline to the nape of my neck so I know how much to gather those stitches down. I've marked that measurement on the strip of linen, which is going to serve as binding along the front edge of the cap and then transition into the loop ties. I can pin the front edge of the binding and then gather the stitches down to fit, concentrating the gathering towards the back of the cap. After everything is gathered and pinned, I'll sew the binding to the cap on the machine and remove the gathering stitches. Then I can fell the other side to the inside of the cap by hand, continuing to hand sew the binding closed down the length of the ties. To make the tie loop, I'll put the cap on, centering the seam, cross the ties at the nape of my neck under my bun, bring them up and cross them at the top of my head, and then bring the ends of the ties together at the back of the head above my bun. I can pin the ends together and then just hand stitch them to finish. The loop should not have any twists in them, the two crossings will mirror each other, and the whole tie should lay flat against the head. For the intermediate coif, I'm going to be using the black linen. Instead of sewing the two halves together on the machine, I'm going to hem the top curve of each side separately by doing just a small double fold and felling that down with a whip stitch. The nice thing about doing this by hand is I can bring it with me anywhere, even the pickup line at school. As I said earlier, the original extant coif has a fairly complicated insertion stitch between the two halves of the cap, but for this version, we'll be mimicking that look with a machine-made black cotton lace. Good thing I got that assorted pack when I was making my black Edwardian chemise. After double checking to make sure the lace is the width I want, it is, I will measure out the length of that curve plus an extra couple of inches just in case. The front edge of the lace will be enclosed by the binding, but the other end will not be, so I'm going to start by hemming that end with a simple double fold hand stitched in place. The hemmed edge of that lace gets positioned at the backside of the coif, right above where the open slit will be. I'll pin the lace into position on that entire side to make sure it is long enough, it is, before stitching it down by hand with a back stitch. Throughout this whole video, all of the hand sewing is done with Burnley & Trowbridge's 100/3 linen thread. Once the first side is sewn, I'll pin the lace to the other half of the coif, checking to make sure I'm not accidentally stretching along the bias of that curve before sewing it down. I don't want the two sides to be uneven. The lace is decently sturdy, but just to be sure that nothing gets damaged over time, I'm going to add a bar tack to the bottom of the lace. This is accomplished by running a few lengths of linen thread between the sides and then doing alternating buttonhole stitches until those threads are fully covered. You can see the process a little better in my pirate shirt video. After a quick nap, I'm back on the bandwagon. The process from here on out is very similar to the first St Birgitta cap, running gathering stitches along the bottom edges, pinning the linen strip into place, pulling the gathering stitches to fit, sewing the binding along the front edge of the cap, felling down the inside of the binding, sewing and turning the ties, and then sewing them into a loop. Thank you to all of my current and continuing Ko-fi members. Your support and the support of all of my members and croissants and 10,000 subscribers makes it easier to do what I do and to provide quality content for everyone. Thank you all so much. Stick around after this brief commercial break for the advanced cap. The advanced coif, made from cream linen, is going to start out the same way as the intermediate one, hemming the top edge of each half of the coif with a double fold and whip stitch. After many attempts, I managed to get to a point where I understand the insertion stitch. It's an interlaced herringbone, which is a mirrored pair of herringbone stitches with some extra rows of looped stitches in and around those threads, so it forms a sort of knotwork situation. The extant coif has 3 sets of interlaced herringbone pairs, making 3 columns of knotwork. A lot of people just make the cap with only 1 column, which is simpler. The cap I already have is made that way, but I wanted to experiment with a slightly more complicated version. In order to keep the insertion stitch nice and uniform, I've cut a length of twill tape and marked a line down each side of it. I'll base the coif to each side of the tape to keep everything the same distance apart. I've seen people use paper or cardstock strips, but I found it to be more trouble than it was worth trying to fuss with that around the curve. Next, I can start marking the cap for the herringbone stitches. In most of the other resources I've seen for this stitch, the markings were done on the layer underneath the coif, usually paper, but I opted to mark directly on the cap for a couple of different reasons. First, as the insertion stitch gets worked, I won't be obscuring my markings as I go. Second, even with a basting stitch, the fabric is still a little wiggly, and I'd rather have the markings on the cap instead of on a different layer to minimize distortion. And third, marking on the cap makes it easier to use my secret layout technique. I'm sure you've noticed that I'm marking different colored dots down each side, 1/4 of an inch apart. Why different colors? As I mentioned before, each column of knotwork is built on a pair of mirrored herringbone stitches. This cap is going to have 2 columns, so I will need 2 pairs or 4 individual herringbone stitches. Each one will have a designated color, which will make it very easy for me to keep track of. Each color is marked 1 inch apart and is offset on the other side by 1/2 inch, so each color zigzags evenly down the cap. Time to start the actual stitching. The 4 herringbone stitches will end up forming a woven net, so each stitch has to be done in a particular way so that one side is always on top. This net forms the foundation for the knotwork later. For thread, I'm using silk from Aowen de Weaver and natural white, of course. Here is the second herringbone stitch. I'm focusing on making sure the stitches I take in the edges of the cap are uniform and that the threads continue to form the foundational weave. I accidentally deleted the footage of the third pass. The hardest part with that step is that it ends up with some threads going over, and under. Trust the process, it'll get fixed on the final pass. Last herringbone stitch. You can see how nice and structured this ends up being. This last pass ends up fixing the unevenness from the third stage. It really looks like very loose tabby weaving. We're set up really well for the interlace stitching. Now it's time to start the knotwork. There are a lot of resources out there showing how to perform the simplest version of the interlaced herringbone stitch. I will link some in the description box. I didn't find many showing how to stack them to form double or triple columns. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to launch into a detailed tutorial in this video, but look for one a week or so after this video goes live. Once it's up, it will be linked in the cards and descriptions of this video. Very basically, I'm going to be making a loop of thread around the outermost 2 sets of thread crosses in an over-under sequence, in keeping with the idea of this visually resembling Celtic knotwork. The second pass forms a mirror of the first series of loops, this time around the second and third sets of thread crosses, and incorporates the curve of the first pass into its knotwork weave. The third pass starts by creating the same series of loops as the first pass along the outermost 2 thread crosses, but on the opposite half of the coif. Final pass. This one mirrors the second pass, but the loops on this pass share that center thread crossing with the loops from the second pass. I know it's a bit difficult to see here, but I will make sure that it's much more visible in the tutorial video with different thread colors so it'll be easier to follow. Again, I'm adding a bar tack at the end of the insertion stitch to maximize stability and protect that end from distortion. From this point on, the process is exactly like the other caps. There is a lovely embroidery motif on the original cap of diagonal stitches forming small diamonds, but I ran out of time. I do plan to add it later though. Once they're finished, I'm going to run all 3 caps through a wash and dry cycle to get rid of the starch, give them a quick iron, and then we're ready for the reveal.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed watching this project at 3 skill levels as much as I did making it. I feel like it's really important to have foundational pieces be as accessible as possible. If you make one of these St. Birgitta caps, I'd love to see it. Tag me on social media. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, click the bell for notifications if you like, and consider sharing this or any of my videos to social media. If you need help finding me on said social media, I am at Opus Elenae everywhere, and those links, as well as the link to my Ko-fi, will all be in the description box below. Until next time, be kind, do the work, continue supporting marginalized people, and keep creating. Hwyl. I feel like that children's book with the monkeys and all the caps.